Real vampires. There are several different types of real vampires within the modern vampire community. Uh, the community is not homogeneous, it's actually quite diverse. And the criterion by which someone is blanketed within the vampire community is quite simply that they identify strongly in one way or the other with the vampire, that they adopt this as an identity. Now, that can mean many different things for many different people. Uh, by far, the largest portion of the vampire community would be the sort of person that is referred to as a lifestyler. Sometimes in a derogatory fashion, they are referred to as fashion vamps. Lifestylers are people for whom the vampire as an archetype has deep personal significance. It is not necessarily a religious or a spiritual path for them, more of a philosophy, and sometimes nothing more than a fashion statement. Lifestylers can probably best be compared to individuals who are very into something like country western music, where there is a specific archetype that is a part of the music and the art and all the related culture that goes along with it, and sometimes fashion that goes along with that as well. So you may have somebody who's really into country western who lives in the heart of New York, but chooses to wear jeans, big belt buckles, cowboy hats, cowboy boots. It's part of who they are, how they identify. For vampires who are lifestylers, that's really about the same thing that's going on. They like the vampire on some level. There is something empowering about that identity, and there is something that appeals to them in the fashion, the art, the music, and the other aspects, the creative aspects generally, that go along with the notion of the vampire. In the early days of the community, 15, 20 years ago, lifestylers also were the largest portion of that community. Now, the next type of vampire that you will encounter in the vampire community is someone who is legitimately vampiric. This falls into two categories: psychic vampires and sanguine vampires. By vampiric, I mean there is something in them that requires them to regularly and actively feed upon the vital force of other people. For psychic vampires, that is in the form of energy, just psychic energy. You might call it prana or chi. Reiki practitioners, Qigong practitioners work with energies, and it is not at this point anymore extraordinary to posit the existence of a vital force above and beyond the physical flesh that moves within and throughout it, that can be psychically sensed, that can leave traces behind on objects, in places, and that can be sensed and manipulated by people, and can be taken by some people, or given in the case of Reiki, the case of Qigong particularly. Reiki is taking an outside energy. Qigong is actually working with your own Qi. Anywho, not to overload you with concepts, psychic vampires need to regularly and actively take human vital energy in order to maintain their own physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. Sanguine vampires need to do the same thing, but with human blood. Human is preferable, willing is required. In both cases, within the community, if you are an active and functional member of the vampire community, you do not feed on unwilling donors. That is tantamount to rape, and it is severely frowned upon. For psychic vampires, it may have fewer real-world repercussions, but for blood drinkers to take from an unwilling donor is assault. And it is wrong on so many levels that if you are someone who preys upon people like that, not only do you not deserve to be considered part of the community, we will have nothing to do with you. People like that are ostracized if we ever find them in our community. Blood drinkers fall into two camps. There are blood drinkers who are more metaphysically inclined. For them, the exchange of blood from donor to vampire is symbolic. The blood almost functions as a carrier for the vital energy, and it is the energy upon which the sanguine vampire, in this case, feeds. Now, not all sanguine vampires believe that there is an energetic component, a vital essence to the blood. There is another camp among the blood drinkers who posit a strictly medical quality to their vampirism. It is physical, material, and not in any way, shape, or form connected with anything metaphysical. There is no woo-woo aspect to their blood drinking. They feel that there is a physical constituent to the blood that has not yet been adequately identified, that for some reason they require. Generally speaking, this sort of vampire holds out hope that the medical establishment will A, take their issue seriously enough, and B, do enough research to identify what it is they need out of the blood, what it is they are self-medicating for, so that at some point there will be a time where they do not have to rely upon the patience and kindness of donors to provide them for what they need in order to feel healthy and well. Now, within the psychic vampires, there are different aspects. There's the idea of an elemental vampire, and you see me kind of draw my brows together because, quite honestly, I understand prana, chi, vital energy. I understand feeding off of the energy of other people. That's why we would call it a vampire in the first place. If I could go out and do the Taoist exercises to exchange chi energy with trees to balance my chi, if I could go and walk through a pristine forest, or get my feet wet in a stream, go to a mountain and ground to the energy there and support myself and get what I need, then I wouldn't really call myself a vampire. It's important when you're talking psychic vampires to understand everybody takes energy. Everybody is constantly engaged in a give and a take of energy. Every time we talk to people, every time we touch them, every time we argue, every time we make love, we are connecting on this level, and we are exchanging something more than flesh in these interactions. The thing that differentiates a psychic vampire is the level of need, the fact that regular sources of energy do not work for them. Or work so poorly and so inefficiently that they are forced to take it directly from the source, which is to say, in order to maintain their own health and well-being, they need to take from other people. Other sources simply will not do. Now, in the late 90s and early 2000s, there were a number of different vampire groups that were active. One of them was the Vampire Church with Damien DeVille. And I'm fairly certain that this is the primary location where the idea of elemental vampirism was discussed, which is to say people who believe that they are vampiric, they identify as vampires, but they feel that the primary thing upon which they feed are elemental energies, energies from storms, fire, a variety of other things. I mean, quite honestly, I ran across someone who, in 2000, quite seriously told me that he had methods for taking energy out of the electrical appliances in his home. And it's not my type of vampirism, but to return to the definition of the vampire community, he identified as a vampire. He held these beliefs, they were sincere for him, and since he wasn't a raving lunatic, or clearly schizophrenic, these were beliefs that were perhaps no more bizarre when you really boil it down to believing that some dead guy on a stick came back 3 days from the dead and went down to hell and released all the souls from all of the punishments that they'd ever gotten into because some gal ate a piece of fruit and fed it to her boyfriend. And that's not to undermine or minimize the significance or the sanctity of the Christian creation stories. However, most beliefs, if you strip them of their importance and relevance to you and just put them in bold language, are going to sound pretty weird. And at the core, although in the vampire community. The vampire is an identity. The vampire community is a legitimate identity group. All of that identity, from the lifestylers to the psychic vampires, the elemental vampires, the hybrids, who both feed off of energy and blood, sometimes in equal measures and sometimes based on whichever one they can obtain at the time, the sanguine vampires and all the rest of it is predicated upon a belief. For the psychic vampires, it is the belief that there is such a thing as psychic energy and that they need it. Now, these beliefs are based off of personal experience, and while some people certainly sound like flaming lunatics, and the online vampire community is full of strident voices that I really wish would be a little quieter in some of their extraordinary claims, many of the people in this community are intelligent, educated, rational individuals who have spent years analyzing their personal experiences, comparing them to the experiences of others, and generally reluctantly coming to the conclusion that those experiences are valid and legitimate, and that vampire is the only word they can really call themselves. Same goes for the blood drinkers, same goes for the hybrids, same goes for the people for whom the vampire is a magical identity, almost a mantle of power that they can adopt in magic and in ritual, an archetype that is almost like, that has as much reality as an ancestor spirit or even a demigod. Think of it as a reality matrix into which they can tap and draw upon the collective beliefs that have been instilled into this notion of what a vampire is: immortal, powerful, seductive, charismatic, often domineering, and capable of swaying the minds of others, as well as ancient. So the vampire community is not at all just a community of one type of thing. We have many different interpretations of even what causes psychic vampirism or the need to drink blood, from medical interpretations to metaphysical interpretations. It is not necessarily a spiritual path or a religion, although there are spiritual paths, religious groups, and occult orders that all have been given birth within the vampire community and are founded primarily upon some aspect or interpretation of vampirism. The bottom line to understand is that many of the people who identify as vampires are people that you may pass in the grocery store, you may go to college with them, you may work with them side by side in your white-collar jobs and be none the wiser. While some definitely adopt a vampire look, up to and including special effects contacts, fangs, and back in the day, long flowing opera cloaks and Victorian drag and just leather and lace and everything else in between, most of us wouldn't stand out in a crowd unless you knew what you were looking for. And at the end of the day, all we ask from anyone is to be given the same rights and the same considerations as anybody else who would be standing in that crowd, who looks differently from you, who may believe differently from you, who is their own person, their own sovereign state, and pursuing their lives in the way that most appeals to them.